Good afternoon, everyone. We are so glad to see you here today. People are going to keep coming in, but we have a busy day, so let's get started. My name is Charlene Margot, and I am co-founder of nonprofit The Parent Venture that brings you this program, the Parent Education Series, now in its 18th year. We are delighted to have partnered this year with Stanford's D.school, and we are featuring some of the authors of this wonderful new series. And today we have with us Dr. Lesley-Ann Noel, who's going to be talking to you about her new book, Design Social Change, Take Action, Work Towards Equity, and Challenge the Status Quo.
Thank you so much, Charlene, and thank you for this invitation. So to tell your audience what's going on, I will be sharing a presentation. I'm going to share some of the big ideas of my book, Design Social Change. And I really welcome audience participation. I'm excited to have people put their questions and comments into the chat. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. Let's see. And I know, okay, you should be seeing me okay now.
Perfect.
Yes, all right. So Design Social Change is part of a series by the D.school at Stanford University, where I was fortunate enough to teach for a year between 2018 and 2019. And as I mentioned to you earlier on, Charlene, that I also, I lived in Menlo Park during that year. So I feel very close to you and members of your community. I'm going to throw a question into the chat, which I might not see to be able to respond to, but I'd love for people to think about it. How do you cook? Do you use a recipe or do you just throw ingredients together? I know some people use recipes and some people just kind of throw things together. And I've been using cooking as a metaphor for action and flexibility in my classes for many years. And so when I was invited to create a book, I started thinking about this metaphor that I had been exploring over time. So here's some visuals from this metaphor that I've been using. I first asked some students, maybe some years ago, what would you get if you add flour and water and maybe one or two other ingredients together? And then they would share with me different things that they would get. Like maybe if you add flour and water, you will get, in some places you might get dumplings, you might get tortillas, you might get roti, you'd get a lot of different food, bread, according to where you live. And what I wanted to do with that metaphor is start to have people see that we can all start with the same ingredients, but actually we can get different results at the end of the day. And here's another way that I was using that cooking metaphor, where students were asking me, well, what are the ingredients of good design? And I said to them, maybe these ingredients were things like empathy, flexibility, relevance, a focus on the future, optimism, risk, creativity. And each of us would then mix these different ingredients in different ways, and we get a different result, right? And I wanted that, again, for the students to see that we are going to customize the way that we add these ingredients together and get something else, right? And I'm reading the chat and enjoying what people are saying. Bev says that she uses a recipe for baking, but not for cooking. Cheryl says she does not use a recipe. And Charlene says, yes, she uses a recipe, but her partner does not. And so you see that we all have these really different ways of cooking. And I love cooking as a metaphor. And I start off the book saying everybody cooks and everybody eats. And then maybe we could use that as I'm using that as a metaphor, as I said, for action and flexibility. And so I'm going to show you two more recipe visuals, and you're probably wondering, what does this have to do with the book, right? But this here, you see some examples that students of mine every single student that I've taught for the last 5 years has had to create a recipe where they had to take some really kind of complicated reading that I gave them, and they had to synthesize that reading into a recipe. And here are some of the recipes that they've created over time. But here actually is the last image of the recipe metaphor that I was using before the cookbook, the ingredients recipe, where I gave this talk to students at a commencement, a graduation ceremony. And I said, well, here are some of the ingredients that maybe you need for a rich design career. But you'll see that the last ingredient here, the most important ingredient, is actually you. So, all right. I like cooking. I like talking about food. I like people to think about recipes. And then in April 2021, the D.school reached out to me and said, hey, do you want to write a book? And of course, I started to think, maybe this book could be a cookbook, right? All right. And so now I'm going to do just a tiny segue into who I am, because you might be wondering, well, who is this person who wanted to write this cookbook? And then how I actually got to the book. So about me, my name is Lesley-Ann Noel, and I'm from a little speck in the middle of nowhere called Trinidad and Tobago. But actually, I've traveled around the world and lived in a lot of different places. So I lived in Brazil for about almost 6 years. I worked in East Africa. Then I moved back to the Caribbean, lived in Raleigh, North Carolina for many years, moved to your part of the world, Menlo Park, for a year, lived in New Orleans, and then moved back to Raleigh, where I am right now. I've been attached to many, 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 many universities, unfortunately or fortunately, including NC State, where I am, Stanford University, where I was to make that connection with the D.school, Tulane in New Orleans, and actually I will be moving to OCAD University in Toronto in July. And my work as a researcher has been focused on equity. So epistemic equity, so I'm known for an interest in decolonizing design, social equity, which is where design for social change falls, education equity, so I've done a lot of research about design-based learning and STEM, and health equity, which I was able to explore when I worked at Tulane. So when the D.school reached out and said, hey, do you want to write a book? This book obviously is going to combine all of my little stories and threads from all over the world. And when I started to combine those threads, I landed on, I started to think about a book about design, cooking, and social justice. And here you can see some of the images from that previous work that I did. I also started to think about something called critical utopian action research, which is a research method that I used when I was doing my PhD, which I'll tell you more about towards the end of the presentation. And then I'm very, very inspired by Paulo Freire. So I thought, okay, maybe this could be a Freirean critical utopian action research cookbook, which I know is a really, really long concept. And then I started to simplify it and say, well, maybe this is a book about strategies for changing the world through design. So ta-da, that's how it started. The original title for the book, and I kid you not, was the Caribbean Afro-Feminist Design Thinking Cookbook. And the idea originally was that this was going to be a cookbook about change. So 10 recipes for challenging the way things are done. And these would have been recipes about resilience and thriving and growth and change. And most importantly, and very excitingly for me, it was going to be a non-academic guidebook. So who was this book written for? As you read the book, which I hope that you will, or I hope that you've already done, you'll hear me writing and talking to two different audiences. So one audience is the person who feels powerless so that they understand that they have more power and agency than they realize. And that's a lot of us, like I'm in that audience. Many of the people in the call might be in that audience. But at the same time, a lot of us who feel powerless, we also actually have power. And so the second audience is the person with power, so that they understand how to make space for other people. And they learn to see where change is needed, and they learn to be open to supporting that change to happen. I'm giving you a little bit of the backstory here, because maybe there are people in this room who would like to write and, are curious to know, okay, how do people write books, right? So like when the D.school reached out to me, for me, people who wrote books weren't alive and weren't ordinary people like me. So, that's why I'm sharing some of this information for other people, so in case they think that they have a book inside of them. So I actually wrote the first draft in 3 weeks during the winter in December 2021. I sat at the table with my parents. I went to visit them. This was late pandemic, and wrote this draft very, very quickly. But actually, later on, we spent months and months of editing and rewriting and clarifying and de-academifying and making sure that the language could be accessible to a wide range of audiences. So from my son, who is 15, to my mother, who is 78, we wanted to make sure a wide group of people could read this book. And then you'll see my Zoom background has one of the images from the book. I'm happy to say that, the book is full of artwork by a friend of mine, Che Lovelace, and we got the right to use 5 of his paintings, and they are then sprinkled throughout the book. And here you see a photograph of me and Che. And I'm showing you some images here of when we opened the book, when we got this sample copy in August. And my son opened it and he's like, oh my God, this is a really colorful book. So that you can see, yes, it is a really colorful book. And it's not a typical design book. I'm from Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean. 2 weeks ago, I launched the book in Trinidad, and there was a lady in the audience who said, I never thought I could read a book about design. And I said, yeah, well, this is not just an ordinary book about design. This is really a book. In her case, it was for her. Different people are going to get different things out of this book, but it's like I'm trying to write to a lot of people at the same time and trying to make this language very accessible to the public. And my last little backstory image before I really jump into the book is that it is part of a series. And this series, I have all of the books in the series. I think it's a very special series because all of the books use design language, but they're not actually design books. So it's like us taking design language out of the world of design and bringing it into the ordinary world, which I think is very exciting. Okay, so now I'll start to tell you a little bit more about the book. So of course, the title of the book changed eventually and it became Design Social Change. But you might be asking, well, what is social change? So I'm going to put an image on the screen, and then I'm going to tell you how I kind of summarize it afterwards. So social change is the alteration of the social order of a society, which may include changes in social institutions, social behaviors, or social relations. Sustained at a larger scale, it may lead to societal transformation. Yes, or social transformation. But how I like to summarize this for my students is that social change happens when an entire society changes the way that it thinks about an issue. So if we think about the course of our lives, or actually the example I like to use is my mother's life, right? My mother is 78. When my mother was born in 1945, her family actually knew people who had been enslaved. And, for me today in 2024, that's something that's unreal. But think about the way an entire society changed its views on owning other people, right? Or think about the way that an entire society change its views on interracial marriage, on same-sex marriage. You know, there are so many issues that required a lot of change in people's thinking. And then when that society has changed the thinking, all of the other structures around, all of the old structures have to change to accompany the way that society changes. So that's basically what that's the kind of change that I'm trying to support through the book, where I'm trying to encourage people to see the change that is needed and then figure out what they're going to do next about it. So in the book, there are 3 big sections and 3 big ideas. And so what I'm going to do is go through those big sections and ideas, and then see if we can have some discussion around that afterwards. So the first big idea in the first section of the book is raising critical awareness, where I'm asking people to learn to see what might be wrong in the world, because sometimes we can't see it. Here's a very colorful spread from the book, What's Wrong? And there are 4 recipes in this section, because I really did start off writing them as recipes, and they turn into essays afterwards. And the first one is knowing yourself. The second one is recognizing oppression. The third one, listening to others and seeing others. And the fourth one, focusing on equity and justice. So in the knowing yourself, I'm going to show this image here, which is the positionality wheel. In the knowing yourself section, I start off saying that for you to build a critical awareness of the world, you have to think about who you are first. And if we tie that to this thing about wanting to design social change, you do have to be able to see your own identities and where you think change is needed first, before moving on to the rest of the world around us. So this activity on the screen is an activity that I created several years ago. I believe I created it in 2018, where I invited design students and researchers to think about 12 elements of their identity. So race and ethnicity, age, gender and sexuality, ability or disability, marital status, parental status, etc. And create some space so that they could actually talk very intentionally about who they are and these identities, and how these identities could affect the way that they are working on a design problem as they move through. Because really, when I went to design school many years ago, we never talked about us and ourselves, and we never acknowledged that actually we change the design problem because of who we are, right? And the idea behind this positionality wheel is that we can actually stop and see intentionally who we are and understand how we might be affecting the issues that we're looking at in a good way or a bad way. You know, how can we actually see how we might bring our own biases and agendas into the work that we do? So that's an activity from the first essay about knowing yourself. I'm going to move into the second essay, recognizing oppression. And this actually is, so this essay is directly based on a class that I teach, where we talk about oppression. And I'm going to read a little bit from the text, right? And so you could see the food analogy in the book as well. So if building a critical awareness is like prepping to cook, putting on your apron and assessing your ingredients, then recognizing oppression is like the first step in the recipe. For me, that's the first step for all my savory dishes. For me, that first step for all my savory dishes is always chopping onions and garlic, the base ingredients, even if I don't know exactly what I want to cook. As I chop the onions and garlic, I reflect on the food I'm about to make. In designing change, you start by understanding oppression, even if you don't know yet what change you're working towards. This is where the cooking up change begins. When you can see the forces that oppress, you can see how to make change. So you know, when we do this class about recognizing oppression, there's actually like a light bulb moment in the class, right? And as you can see in the second paragraph, which I won't read, oppression comes from the Latin word opprimere. And if you can think about someone being pressed down, that is really where they're being oppressed. And so if we want to design social change, we have to think about where are people being pressed down in society and then react to that in ways that we can lift them up. So one design question that I ask my students, I encourage my students to reflect on, and I ask other people, not students, but other people who I work with, is what are barriers to thriving for the people that you serve? I've put these examples, these things, these isms that create barriers for us in the world, end racism, end heterosexism, end ableism, end xenophobia. And I do encourage you to think about what needs to change in the world around you, and how can you make others aware of this change that is needed. And if you have the book, I'm going to put some cliff notes here. There are some interesting, there is a guide on page 34 and 35 that helps you understand different levels of oppression. And on page 51 to 53, you can check for equity and inequity in your processes. So this is just a quick look at the guide with examples of different types of oppression that people face, such as internalized oppression, interpersonal oppression, institutional oppression, and structural oppression. And this is just a little bit of the checklist. All right, so that's those are the big ideas in the first section of the book, where you have to understand yourself and you have to learn to see the world around you before you start to make change, right? And part of that thing also of learning to see the world around you is that Paulo Freire, who I reference many times in the book, actually says in one of his books, it may be in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, that as you move into spaces of more and more privilege, you no longer can see the oppressing forces that held you back in the class that you were before. So as you move into the middle class, you can no longer see the what held you back when you were in the working class. So that's why we have to learn to see this world around us as we want to make change. All right, so I'm going to move into the second section, right? So the second big idea of the book is about deepening emotional intelligence, where we're asking, what does it feel like? Okay. And here I'm really asking people to dig deep, be open to the wide range of emotions that many of us feel, because maybe the worlds that we live in, we're kind of expected to be like cold, and we're expected to be a little bit impartial or neutral. And I'm actually saying, no, let's open up space for a lot of emotions so that we can understand change much more deeply. There are 3 recipes or essays in this section. The first one is about leaning into anger and joy. The second one is about being intentionally oppositional. And the third one is stronger together. So I'm going to share a little bit from these 2 essays. And I remember I'm encouraging you, if you need, please feel free to put questions and comments in the chat as we move along. But anger is an emotion that I focused on because I think anger is a very suppressed emotion. It's like not socially acceptable. And so I remind, and these are actually words from the text, right? Anger can provide necessary cues on change that is needed in the world. It can create momentum. It's like an additional spice that is needed for change. And don't be afraid of it, because very often we are kind of trained that we should not be angry, or we judge other people as they are angry, but actually for us to do good design, we have to be able to read that anger, or even if we are angry, we have to learn to take that anger and channel that anger into action. So we need anger actually for action. And then the other feeling that I write about is joy, because in the world of social design where I am in, we actually don't focus on joy and joyous experiences enough. So I remind people that fixing problems may not lead to joy, and that we can also frame design and social change around positive feelings and experiences such as being peaceful, powerful, and joyful. And in the book, there is an emotions wheel, the wide range of emotions. And psychologists say that those emotions can be actually reduced to 6 core emotions that we should be looking for in people as cues. And we can respond then to those cues through design. And then the third essay in that section is about stronger together. And in that essay, I'm emphasizing that even though our worlds might focus on individual output and achievement, the reality is we can't change the world if we're working by ourselves. So we have to build communities around us. And even if we don't have these communities, but we need feedback, and we need people around us who are going to also move with us through the change process. And so some of these people are like-minded souls. They think like us, and you see that in the text here, where I'm asking people to think about the community that supports you. Who are the like-minded souls? Which of course, most of us want like-minded souls around us, but who are also the dissenting voices, because we don't only need people who are going to tell us that we are amazing and the work that we do is amazing. We also need some people who will kind of challenge us in the work that we do. And then who are the people, who are the dissenting voices and the people with whom you will make change, because you have to make change with other people. So who can you co-design with? And as you can see here, that there are actually activities in the book. And so this is one of the activity sections where we're asking, what communities are you part of? Do you have relationships with groups, those 3 groups that I just mentioned, like-minded people, people who will disagree with you, and people who you'll make change with? And how can you reach out to build communities around you? And how can you slow down to honor the relationship building process? Okay. And so I'm going to move you now into the next big section. So the next big section is about envisioning equitable futures. And the question I'm asking is, what is the world that you want to design? The big, so you see here, this is the artwork from this section. And there are a few essays in this section. One is emancipation, liberation, and abolition. The next one is designing new worlds and futures. And then the third one is prototyping and reflecting. And this third section, actually the entire book, but this third section in particular is very tied to my PhD work. So I'm going to do a little bit of a segue into the PhD work, which probably will appeal to a lot of the educators in the room. So I mentioned at the start of the talk that I use this framework called critical utopian action research, which is a little bit of an obscure action research framework that I am absolutely in love with, right? And I've continued to use it for many years, for 5 or 6 years. But in that framework, we ask the question, what is wrong? Where do we want to go? And how can our dreams become reality? And maybe out of curiosity for the people who are, for the educators in the room, the circles outside are the Principles of Empowering Education by Ira Shaw. So I had combined Ira Shaw's Principles of Empowering Education with these 3 questions of critical utopian action research. And then I worked with children in Trinidad, children at a rural school in Trinidad, where over 3 weeks, every week I asked them first. We had a different theme each week, and we started off asking what was wrong. We tried to figure out where did the children want to go, and we encouraged them to think about their utopia. And then we designed the path to get to the utopia that they were interested in. So I'm going to share with you 2 little images from these children, right? After I asked them what was wrong with the world, right? And so the first child, he was 12, and he said, you know, what's wrong with my world? He said, you know, on Sundays, I don't actually feel like getting up to go to church, but I actually like church, but I just don't want to go there. I'm like, okay, so where is it that you want to go? And he thought and he thought and he thought, and he then drew this concept of Skype church, where he would be able to stay at home, sleep late, but still have that connectivity and watch and connect with people on church via this technology. And interestingly, he drew this in 2017, but of course, afterwards we had a pandemic and all of that. And actually, in mid-deep pandemic, everyone was actually using his design unintentionally and going to church via Zoom for those people who go to church. So he was able to see into the future and create that utopia. Whereas this younger child, you know, when I asked what was wrong with the school, this child drew this drawing about the school actually having a terrible smell. And then she drew the school of the future, which had that didn't have the smell. And interestingly, the principal said that he had no idea that the children were affected like that, but at least the drawing was a way for him to be able to understand the needs of the children better and for them to communicate faster and more deeply. And so I share these for you to see that in making social change, it's really important for us to come back to this first question, where we're asking people what is wrong, and then we can get people to dream together about where do we want to go, and then we could figure out what's the way to get there. So like in this case, yes, the principal was able to take this dream and figure out where to go next. All right. Okay. But I'm actually starting to wind down. So I'm hoping, yes, that there'll be a lot of questions in the Q&A section. So I'm coming to the end of the book, the afterword, right? And I'm going to share more from the backstory. I started off writing this book as a cookbook. And then throughout the year or so that I worked with my editor, Jen, and we were tweaking and changing the content of the book, Jen let me run with the metaphor because she knew that I would develop it fully. But then after, we removed that cooking metaphor somewhat. Why did we do that? So I'm actually going to read now from the text again. There is no single recipe for creating lasting social impact. We can't just download a recipe to follow step by step, and then, ta-da, we have equity and social change. Throughout this book, I have sought to share strategies that I've learned from years of reading, doing, and design practice that could be helpful in your quest for equity, thriving, social justice, and social change. Still, like the person who adapts a recipe to suit what they have available in their pantry, you're going to have to adjust these strategies to suit the problems you're addressing and the change you want to make. So the reason that it did not remain as an actual cookbook is because we didn't want people to think, oh, well, I just follow these steps and I've made social change. But we did want people to see that, oh, here could be some of the ingredients for social change, and I'm going to have to experiment with how I put them together differently, knowing that the change that I want to make might be different to the change that other people want to make. And then the way that I go about making that change might be different because of the way that I've combined the recipes and the context that I'm in. So I'm going to show this last slide where I'm asking people in the audience, and you can be really free and put it in the chat. What is the social change that you want to create? And what are the steps that you think you might want to do to move forward on that? So I am going to stop sharing. And then I would love to open it up for conversation.
Thank you so much, Lesley-Ann Noel. That was incredible. And you really had us all just, and so engaged with what you're saying. And we're hearing it in the chat. So, I have read your book, and it was so much more than I expected in so many ways. But I love the cookbook metaphor, and I think it really gets people to relate, right? As you say, many of the parents with us tonight or today probably have teenagers. So I think about, you have a teenager, you know what this is like. So some of my questions and the questions from the audience will probably reflect that. So here we go. This is actually my question. I just was so interested to hear what you had to say. Why is it so important to know yourself before tackling social change? You talk about your own positionality and the diversity within you.
So I think, well, there are a lot of answers to that, but I'm going to start off saying that we actually should maybe resist the pressure for us to be homogenous or for us to kind of disappear or be invisible. Because if we want to make social change, we have to start to see our own issues for ourselves, right? And so, if I talk about my own positionality, if I go into design, if I'm talking about designing social change, I have to be able to think about what are the challenges that I really face as a mother? What are the challenges that I really face as a woman? What are the challenges that I really face as a Black person? And, once I start to kind of isolate all of these different identities, I start to really find places where change is needed. Whereas if I'm trying to kind of maybe somehow fit in and disappear, I'm not really going to pay attention to the changes that are needed. It's my point of view and your point of view and, everyone in your audience's point of view that we actually need to find where change is needed. We can't really find the really deep points where change is needed by catering to like an average that doesn't really exist, right? So the thing about knowing yourself is about you starting to see where there are some real issues that you could be passionate about, and that you could bring to the surface in a way that other people might not be able to see.
And Lesley, as you say that, I'm reflecting as a mother, as an educator, and I think, how can we get this into schools? How do we let our kids understand the diversity within them and what they bring to the table? I think so often in schools, they feel like a peg in a round hole, that they just they don't get a chance to really reflect on who they are and how that impacts their education. What do you say about that?
Well, so I teach at college level, so I probably have some more flexibility than people teaching at other levels. But I think it is important for us to create space for people to think about themselves. If you are working with younger children, like I did with my field work, you can have people draw themselves and really start looking at all of these different elements of their identity. So that they understand that difference is good and needed. I'll share an anecdote that people in the room might relate to. So I learned about writing about positionality when I was doing my research, and I hadn't done that before. And what writing about positionality did for me in my research is that I was actually able to see the biases that I was carrying into the research, but actually in a positive way. So I set up my study around fourth graders in Trinidad in a rural village. Only after I sat down and I reflected deeply on my own positionality, I was able to see, oh, I chose the age group of the children because they were the same age as my son. I mean, I found all of this scientific evidence to back up why I chose that age group. But the real reason I chose it is because that was kind of like my agenda. I was able to see, just all of these different biases, I was able to see clearly. And then I could figure out, how do I leverage this in the work that I do? And this is valid in qualitative research. We just say this, right? I thought about bringing that positionality into the design class because I remember sitting once with a group of designers in a college setting. And I remember hearing one of the designers, the participants, say something, yeah, we're all the same and we have the same perspective. I thought that's actually really interesting because of course they weren't all the same, right? When I looked at the group of people, they came from really, really diverse backgrounds, really diverse gender identities, really even diverse nationalities. And I was struck by how disappointed I felt in the moment that this person felt pressured to fit in, when actually we would have done much better design if they didn't fit in. If they really examine the diversity of the group and use that diversity in the work that they were doing, right? So I encourage people to find ways to bring it in. You can have people write essays about positionality. You can have people draw themselves, maybe sometimes even interview each other. But I've found that getting students to talk about their identities makes us get to much deeper conversations in the work that we do.
That makes perfect sense, Lesley-Ann. It's like one of our attendees said, listen to the kids, hear their voice. And I believe that many of our students say that the schoolwork doesn't feel relevant to them. But if it did, we would all do better, right?
Yes.
Next question is from Leticia. It's a long one, but I'm going to read it because I think it's really a valuable statement about what you're doing. Wonderful info. She says, how do you mobilize parents on a large scale and get parents who think the ship has sailed to realize how much power they actually have in community? I'm thinking about rethinking giving my child a smartphone before high school. Many of us would like to mobilize around the research in the new book, The Anxious Nation, Jonathan Haidt, but we don't know how to get started. We do agree that we're stronger together.
So the question is, how do we mobilize parents on a large scale and get parents who think the ship has sailed to
Yeah.
well, yeah, people have power. I don't know if I have an actual answer to that, but we can get parents to understand their power through communication with them, right? So when I did that work with children, I had to bring the parents in before, and we had to sit down and we had to talk about the themes that we wanted to that we were going to develop in the class. And parents can be engaged the way other people in society can be engaged. And so I would say maybe through frequent communication and conversation with the parents, that opportunity for engagement is how you see people have more power, how people can understand that they have more power and agency.
Absolutely. I started this program 18 years ago in the library at our local high school, Menlo Atherton. You've probably driven by it, Leslie.
Yes.
Library. 18 years later, we've reached hundreds of thousands of families, and now people in 50 states and 67 countries. Why? Because we decided to give parents voice and say, you're important. What you think and do matters. We want to hear. So we created a community of parents and caregivers and educators, but every little bit helps. And parents, you do have the power. You write to your principals, you write to your school boards, you write to the superintendent, things happen. And that's
yes. So yeah, so you are an example of what I'm talking about in this book, because very often people ask me, well, what is it that you want people to change, right?
Yeah.
And then I say, actually, it's not really what I want people to change. I really want people, when they read the book, to feel energized to do something. I'm not prescribing what the thing is. So, you were energized and you created this network. Maybe someone else is going to be energized and say, you know what, the thing I want to change is, I'm going to give a random example, the number of left-handed desks in a classroom or left-handed scissors in a classroom, or, and we all find the things that we think are meaningful, and that again is based on our positionality. And then we have to galvanize change around that. And it's that cumulative action by a lot of people that's going to get us to changing the world, in quotes.
Yes, and it all starts with these Margaret Mead says, right?
Yes.
The only power that ever existed was the power of people to make small changes. And I think that's what we're doing. You are on a big scale here. We're on a smaller scale, but boy, that's that we wanted to help educate parents. We knew that they knew their children best, but we wanted to provide skills and strategies so that they could better communicate with their kids. And that's been our mission. So my next question, and I love what's going on in the chat here. This is just wonderful to see. Leslie, how did motherhood change your perspective on the need for social change? You shared some of that, but you say in the book, as parents, we want better for our children.
Yes, I think that motherhood really made a big change, because it meant that I couldn't just sit back and be okay with what was just good enough for me. Like I could be a little bit more apathetic before I became a mother, because I could say, whatever it is isn't good enough, but it's okay. I live my little life and I'm not going to get involved, right? As a parent, I really had to become more engaged in the things that I could see were problematic, because I know that I am trying to eliminate some of those things for my son, for his friends, for my niece, for my nephew. So it really, it made me much more passionate about action. Whereas before I was a parent, maybe I was just satisfied maybe in seeing what was wrong with the world, but I mightn't have done anything, because I'm like, okay, maybe that's somebody else's problem. Motherhood made it my problem and my concern to make sure the world could be better for my son, who's going to move into some of these spaces that I occupy right now. So I think that a lot of parents, we can use that energy around the issues that that we think are important. Like I think I'm seeing in the chat, some people are saying like maybe that they're not thinking that they're getting results sometimes, or when we think we're not getting results around the things that we need change, that the change we want to see, that's really where we need these communities around us, where we need to find other people who are passionate about the same issues, and then figure out what is a new action that we're trying to create and make because of that.
Well, that really brings us to a couple of the next questions, Leslie. And one is, you and I talked about before we got on screen about how I was happy to see you focusing on ableism as one of the isms that really needs to have concrete change. And it is something that's often ignored. So a question from a parent here, and I know that this has to do with school and systems, is what do you do when you feel like your attempt at making change is ignored?
I'm smiling because I'm thinking of different responses. What do you do when you feel like your attempt at making change is ignored? I become louder. I don't know if that's a great response or not, but if I'm not being heard in one context, I'm going to find another context to talk about the issue that I'm concerned about. And there is an anecdote that I talk about in the book where it's relevant to this question. It doesn't directly answer it, but there was a point where I was working somewhere and I was just angry all the time. And then one of my colleagues, who was a professor, he pulled me aside and he said, I can see that you are this angry. And he said, and I said, yes, I'm angry because my team is not listening to the things that I'm trying to propose. And that professor, I think, gave me the best advice ever, where he said, well, write about it. Take what that thing is, that thing that you're angry about, and share it with a different audience. He says, okay, your team isn't interested in that information, put the information out anyway. So maybe in response to that question, that was just asked about what to do when you feel like your attempt at making changes being ignored, try talking to a different audience. Try talking on a bigger scale or a different scale. Try finding a community around you that can amplify the word, and it might sound vague, but it's these little steps that get us towards highlighting the change that we are interested in seeing. So maybe in response to the next question, Charlene, I don't know if you want to read it.
Oh, sure. It's a really good question. Could you give a concrete example of a small action you took that impacted an area of concern?
So that one, I have to think of a few things, but the first example I'm going to give is tied to that thing that was making me so angry, right? Where the professor said, well, write about it. So I'm an academic, and maybe I'll give an academic answer first. I wanted to propose certain ideas into a group that I was working in, well, a class that we were teaching, and my group wasn't interested in that. And I started to write about these ideas that were being left out. And I think what has happened is, because I was able to channel all of my angry energy into writing, I think what has happened over time is that these ideas have become mainstream, because I put them out there. So maybe that's not a real concrete example, because I'm still leaving it a little bit vague. But it is that I think I have been able to play a role in changing the mainstream ideas of my profession by just putting my own ideas out there, even though they were being discounted and discarded in the work context that I was in. I'm thinking of other more concrete examples of small actions. So I'm going to give like a really tiny example of a small action that impacted an area of concern, to see that sometimes we can make big change or we can make small change. So I made big change when I was angry, and I wrote all of my angry papers and whatnot, because I changed the way the mainstream ideas in my profession work. But there's also small actions, like I teach this class and I ask students to tell me all the time what is wrong, because I teach actually the angriest group of students in my college, because they think that they don't get enough resources, and I mean, just one day they sat down and they're venting about all of the things that are wrong. And they said, you know what, none of these power cords even work. The tech guy just happened to pass. I said, hey, come on in, the students want to talk to you. And they just said, hey, these power cords, these outlets don't work. The very next day we had power in the classroom. I mean, that's an idea of like really small action. But my students and I, we talk about that all the time. They had spent years complaining about the lack of power in the classroom and had never done anything. And all we had to do on that day was actually say it to the right person, and we got action the following day. So, I think, again, it's a small example, but we can make big change and we can make little change. But change, the social change that we're trying to get, is based on a lot of cumulative efforts. So it doesn't matter if you're just doing a small thing, and it doesn't matter if you're doing a big thing. It's that all of us together are making social change together.
Thank you. That was a great answer, Leslie. So I think about in reading the section of your book where you discuss oppositionality, it made me think about teenagers and also we're calling her a teenager, my 2-year-old granddaughter. But how do we harness that oppositionality and passion of teens towards social change? I think so often people see that passion and opposition as a negative, but it doesn't have to be, does it?
No, I don't know. Let me see how I'm going to answer this. The teens I know want to change a lot of stuff, right? Or maybe it is that actually they start off first thinking that nothing can be changed.
Mhm.
And then we, through our conversations about, where we are asking them, that's what I'd encourage parents, ask the teens around you, what are the things that need to be changed in their view? And let's hear what are the things that they think are important. And then we could sit down and strategize with them and say, well, what are some of the things that we can do? Can we write a letter to an editor somewhere? Can we create a TikTok video about something? What are the things that the teens want to do to make the issues that they're interested in, to create some awareness around the issues that they're interested in? So, I teach young people, they're older than teens, but we end every semester with everybody fired up saying, this is the thing that I want to change in the world. I actually think for me, it has been easier to get young people interested in making change while they still have a beautiful image of the world, or they're cynical in their own way. It's more difficult sometimes to get older people to want to make change happen. So I think, yes, we can all engage the young people in our life to make change around them.
Well, Lesley-Ann, we have come to the end of our hour. I have one final question for you. The time has just flown. It's been inspiring just to talk to you, but here's the question we love to end with, and I bet you'll have a good answer. After everything you have experienced and studied and taught, what gives you hope?
What gives me hope is actually related to your last question, that I can always get young people to eventually say what they think is the change that is needed in the world. And I'm always inspired. I'm mostly inspired by the change they say that they want to have. So I know at time, I'm going to say the last thing. I ask young people to imagine the world 30 years from now. So I'll say in 2050, the world will have X. And then they fill up a page of all of the dreams and ideas that they have of this fantastic world that we'll have in 2050. And so that inspires me and keeps me going.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Lesley-Ann Noel. I just had a feeling you would give a great answer. We are so grateful to all of you who've been with us today. Wonderful conversation in the chat. I can see we've got a lot of change makers in the audience, and I think that your book, I really recommend folks you pick up a copy, Design Social Change. You can find it on Stanford's D.school site. There's a whole section on the D.school books and different ways that you can buy it. But again, thank you for a wonderful conversation today and for taking your time and generosity to be with us. Take care, everyone, and hope to see you again soon. Bye for now.